Hello, everyone. Welcome to Indigenous Education's second set of webinar series. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the MCAT, and later tonight, after the MCAT is done at 7:30, we will be starting with the GMAT. So, my name is Julie Mosconi. I am one of the Indigenous Education Inc. staff members here, alongside with Milani Fox. We are very pleased to introduce Jay Rosner from the Princeton Review Foundation, who will be talking to us tonight about the MCAT. Without further ado, Jay, take it away.
Thank you, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're all set.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to be talking about the MCAT, trying to give you about 50 minutes of the best information I think I can give you on how to approach the MCAT, how to think about it, how to prepare for it. So we're talking about unmasking the MCAT, and I just want to start the first 5 or 6 slides with a review of what we talked about on the webinar last week. And I'll be referring to the most important 5 or 6 slides from last week's webinar, just so that I'm sure that you got it when you saw them. So the first issue is, what does the MCAT measure? And here's my opinion of what the MCAT actually measures. Does it measure how intelligent you are? I say no. Does it measure how well you'll do in medical school? I say no. Now, it does help a little bit in predicting your first year GPA in medical school, which is something, but it's just not very much. And so you don't want to think about connecting your MCAT score with how you'll do in medical school. They are significantly disconnected, even though the MCAT does help predict a little bit your first year GPA. Does the MCAT does the MCAT measure how good you are at the MCAT? And of course, the answer is yes. That's exactly what it measures. And if you have a great score, it means that you're good at the MCAT. And if you don't, you can take steps, and you should take steps to improve your score. Now, when we talk about MCAT preparation, everyone is doing MCAT preparation. Everyone is doing intensive MCAT preparation because the MCAT is so important to admission to medical school and because medical school is so highly competitive. So the question is not whether you're going to do MCAT prep, it's how are you going to do it? How are you going to approach it, etc. So the next slide is our survey questions, and if we can do the polling questions, please, so we can see who's on the webinar tonight.
Sure. If everyone wants to look off to the right-hand side of their screen here, we've got a poll up about what year or status you are in your academic career. I'll give you about 10 to 15 more seconds to respond. All right. So right now we're looking at 50% at college seniors and 50% at college graduates.
Okay, thanks very much. Our next point is, I'm wondering whether anyone took an official MCAT. Can we do a polling question on that, please?
Of course. And again, look off to the right side of your screens, please, and we will be setting up this poll. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer that one. All right, about 10 more seconds here. All right, Jay, we're looking at about half of our audience has taken an official MCAT before and half has not.
Okay, that's very interesting information because with the recent changes, the relatively recent changes in the MCAT, we may have some folks who took a different version of the MCAT, the previous version of the MCAT. Let me just talk a little bit about affirmative action and Indian students. Do we have a polling question on that one? I think we do, don't we?
I believe we do.
Okay, let's get that polling question up. And for those of you attending the webinar, We're not going to do dozens of polling questions. I think this might be our last one, but it does give me some initial information as to who's in the audience and what kinds of comments I should make.
Yep, so if you look up to the right-hand side once more, we do have that polling question up and all set for you to go. About 10 more seconds to respond. All right, we're looking at 100% who are unable to explain affirmative action and how that affects Native students.
Okay, let me then take a couple of minutes to talk about this. I think it's an important topic, and I think Native students should be able to explain affirmative action. Often Native American students get asked about affirmative action, and it's not that complicated topic. It's pretty straightforward. Affirmative action has been used by most universities in the United States for the last 50 years. It's also called race-conscious admissions. And what affirmative action and race-conscious admissions do is they allow an admissions office to give a small break to underrepresented minority students, like Native American students. So as Native students, in applying to most medical schools, the schools can give you, and most schools do give you, a small break on your MCAT scores and your GPA. Now, notice the word small or little. It's not a large break. It's not a major break. It's a small break. It's a small allowance. And the reason they do that is most schools have too few Native American students and they want more. And that's one way to get more. You know that Native American students are woefully underrepresented in medical school and in higher education in general. So affirmative action and race-conscious admissions are methods that admissions officers can use to give small breaks to Native students so that they can admit a few more than they otherwise would. Now, affirmative action has been under attack for 30 years now. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in a decision called Fisher, just 3 months ago, affirmed that admissions officers can use affirmative action. The Supreme Court approved affirmative action. There is one hitch, though, and that is there are 8 states in the United States where state university medical schools are prohibited from using affirmative action because of a legal procedure that occurred in that state, almost always through a state ballot initiative. So California is the largest of those states. So if you're applying, for example, to a state university, not a private medical school, but a state university medical school, that medical school cannot use affirmative action, cannot use race-conscious admissions, cannot give that small break to Native students. So again, while most schools and all the schools in 42 states are permitted by the Supreme Court to do that, the state schools in 8 states have been prohibited from doing that. That's what affirmative action is, and that's what race-conscious admissions is. And I'm a very strong proponent of affirmative action because it permits schools to admit more Native students and more African American students and more Latino students because there aren't enough of those students in our medical schools or in higher ed in general. Now, just another point on Fisher. Abigail Fisher is a young white woman who sued the University of Texas. It's an undergraduate case, but the principle of affirmative action applies, and the Supreme Court's decision applies to medical schools and all of higher education. She sued the University of Texas because, and her claim was the University of Texas was discriminating against her because she's white. She was being discriminated against because she's white. And there are a lot of folks who think that's sort of absurd. But the courts took it very seriously, and they heard her case, and the court decided against her. And what actually happened is all that Abigail Fisher had to do was be in the top 10% of her high school graduating class, and she would have automatically qualified for admission to the University of Texas. She did not do that. Her grades weren't good enough to place her in the top 10%. So she didn't get in that way. There was a second way that she could get in. The second way involved a use of affirmative action. She didn't get in the second way. So she had 2 shots at the apple. She didn't make either one. She lost her case. And when the loss was announced, someone developed the hashtag Becky with the bad grades and stuck it on her. And, you know, I think it's deserved. She brought a nasty lawsuit that she shouldn't have brought, and she lost it. And all she had to do was get better grades to get into the University of Texas. So she's going to live her life with the tag Becky with the bad grades. And some people might think that's harsh. I think it's well deserved. So a little story for you, and a little help to you so that you can describe affirmative action pretty simply to if someone asks you about it, or if the topic comes up. Next slide, please. Okay, again, we're reviewing here how much MCAT preparation do I recommend. And if you were on the webinar last week, you'll remember that I was talking about 7 to 8 weeks for GRE, GMAT, and LSAT. MCAT is 14 to 16 weeks minimum. So you're looking at almost 4 months, and some people do a little more than that. The issue is, however, if you do a lot more than that, not to burn out. You also want to do 7 to 8 practice tests, not more than 1 per week, so 1 every 2 weeks or so, to mark your progress, to give you a sense of the length of the test. 7 to 8 is, I think I'm recommending a high number. I think other test prep experts might recommend 5 or 6, but you can see you want to be in that zone of a number of practice tests so that you're taking enough practice tests. So if you do less prep than what I'm suggesting here, you're going to get lower than your best score. Why would you want to do that? If you do more, you risk burning out. And you recall that I said that you can think about this as rehearsal for an artistic performance or training and preparation for an athletic performance game event. And we're talking for MCAT, it's about 1 season of a high school sport, actually a little more, because a season of a high school sport is maybe 3 months. So it's a little more than a season of a high school sport. It's a serious commitment of time. It's not going to kill anybody. So please do it if you want to get your best score. We can go to the next slide. And this is the wonderful medicine wheel from my friend Frank Edwigishik. You recall that Frank gave me permission to use this, actually encouraged me to use this with native students. He was quite taken with the fact that the 4 bolded factors here are 4 things that I've been talking about for years in terms of getting oneself ready to get their best score on a standardized test like the MCAT. You want to be mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually in the best possible situation that you can put yourself in when you walk in to take the official test. And you know how to do that, and it's different for each person. You know how to do that for yourself. And review one more time with PACES, my acronym for the goal of your being able to say honestly, right before walking into the official MCAT, that you have a good plan, that you had a good plan, and I've just given you a plan. It was on the previous slide. You acted on your plan. You actually implemented your plan. You studied intensively for an appropriate amount of time. You're confident and calm as a result. You're energized because you have those factors optimized so that you can go in and do your best work. Oh, I said 3+ hours of my best work. That's wrong. MCAT is 7 hours. So we're going to need to correct that on the PowerPoint. I missed that one. And the S stands for secure. You have a fallback, a backup test date, but it's kind of penciled in on your calendar. You don't sign up for it. You don't pay for it. Pencil it in on your calendar. It's there if you need it. But you'd rather not use it. You'd rather knock it out the first time. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Here are some MCAT basics, and I have CBT, you might recall from last week, in parentheses. It's a computer-based test. The test is delivered on computer. You can move around within a section. You can skip questions and come back to them within a section, which is the basic way that the computer-based test mechanism works. The MCAT is offered 15 times a year, duration 7 hours, 30 minutes, with 3 optional 10-minute breaks and 1 optional 30-minute lunch break. And believe me, you want to take a lunch break, get some nutrition and get some energy in the middle of the MCAT. And you probably want to take all the breaks that are offered. It's just a good idea to get up, move around, get your body, maybe get some fresh air during a break. Most people will enhance their performance slightly after a break if they take a break, move around, and kind of recharge their batteries a little bit, rather than jumping right into the next section and skipping a break and not having that kind of refreshing time to just move around and as I said, recharge. Now the sections on the MCAT: physical sciences, verbal reasoning; biological sciences, psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. The last one is the new section. And for those of you who've taken the MCAT before, if you took it more than a year or two ago, you took a different version of the LSAT, of the MCAT, I'm sorry, which did not have that section. Physical sciences has been on the test. Biological sciences has been on the test. Both of those sections contain chemistry. The amount of chemistry and the amount of physics has been, or the number of questions in those topics has been reduced somewhat on this current version of the MCAT and replaced by the psych section questions. Verbal reasoning has always been on the MCAT. The cost is up to $300. There's a fee waiver provision or a fee reduction provision. You want to go online, check that out, and if you need a fee waiver or reduction, file the procedures, just do that very early. The maximum score on the MCAT, on this new version of the MCAT, they made 528. There's no magic in that. It's just kind of an arbitrary way they set the scale. And I'll talk a little bit more about scoring in a subsequent slide. And so the average score in the 4 sections is 125 on each section, and a national average score is about 500 or a little more than 500. Next slide, please. So here are I'm going to talk about the 4 sections. I'll talk about 2 sections here and then 2 sections on the next slide. First section, biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. And they should have made that title even longer, but that's the way they made it. 59 multiple choice questions, 95 minutes. And what it tests are, as I've listed here, bio, organic, and inorganic chem, and biochemistry. The chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. And I encourage you not to memorize the titles of these sections. I encourage you to call the first section bio and the second section chem. If you notice, 59 multiple choice questions, 95 minutes. And the topics are biochem, bio, general chem, organic chem, and physics. So chem is in both sections, as you can see, even though only one section is called chem. That's just the way it is. And who knows why they split it up that way. The physics questions are relegated to the second section, and the bio questions are in both sections, and chem questions are in both sections. So that's just the way it is. Next slide. So the psych section is psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. Same 59 questions, 95 minutes. Psych, sociology, and biology. So bio pops up yet again. But if you look at questions from this section, you'll see that there's a lot of psychology going on. A lot of psychology being tested. And then the fourth and final section, which I call verbal, they call critical analysis and reasoning skills. 53 multiple choice questions, it's 90 minutes. And as you can see here, it's similar to reading comprehension sections on the other standardized tests. So if you took an SAT, if you took an ACT, if you took a GRE, if you took a GMAT or an LSAT, or even looked at those tests, you will have seen reading comprehension. It's simply a passage, which might be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 paragraphs, and then a series of questions after that passage, questions where you were asked about the content of the passage, the style of the passage, all kinds of questions relating to that particular passage. A variety of humanities and social science disciplines are the topics of those passages. And I've read that the passages don't really cover science topics. So it's humanities and social science, not the hard sciences. Okay. MCAT scoring, which I referred to before briefly, the overall MCAT score is 472 to 528, with an average score being 500. And all sections have scores of 118 to 132. 125 is the average. So you'll have 4 section scores between 118 and 132. You will add them up, and they will total between 472 and 528. Why they pick those numbers, I don't know. And if you'll notice, the spreads aren't that dramatic. It's just 7 points one way or the other in each of the sections. So it's not as if students are spread out widely across the range of scores. It's the narrowest range of scores that I've ever seen on a standardized test ever. Just the way it is. They decided that for their reasons, and they don't explain why. How to best use practice MCAT tests is the next topic. And you want to take practice MCAT tests about once every 2 weeks. I forgot the word every there. And if you're wondering why, here are some reasons. You want to take time to carefully analyze and work on your weaknesses and strengths between the practice tests. You want regular exposure to building your stamina. You want to be able to practice pacing, and you want to be able to get a full test checkup. And the way this works is you might be really knocking out in your practice, in your test prep, all the bio questions. You're just nailing them all. And you're doing it because you're kind of taking your time and you understand what's going on. But when you get in a practice test situation, it might be possible that because you're taking your time, you're not moving quickly enough, and you actually can't do as well on the bio questions in the practice test format. And that's something you learn in the practice test, so that when you going back and practice between tests, you're trying to build your speed and do those bio questions more quickly. That's just one example. What you learn from a practice test is how your preparation is actually going and where you need to spend and allocate more of your time and energy on which kinds of questions, so that you can do better on the next practice test. The whole procedure is trying to improve your skills so that you can do better on the next practice test. And that's why I say take them about once every 2 weeks or so. If you took them about every 3 weeks through a 4-month MCAT prep, that wouldn't be too bad. Now, the bottom point on this slide is quite important. Much more significant than your practice score is the number of correct and incorrect answers you're getting on the various question types. So, for example, if you're working on physics questions really intensively before the next practice test, because that was a weakness you had on the last practice test, one of the first things you're going to look at after that practice test is how you did on the physics questions that you've been working on intensively for the last 2 weeks. Now, you're not working exclusively on physics questions. You're working on questions from all the sections of the test in each week of your practice, but you might have decided to emphasize physics questions, so that's what you would look to. And so your score on that practice test is less important than how you're doing on what you worked on just prior to that test. Now, another concept that you should think about is refocusing. Everyone on these tests gets distracted. Virtually everyone whom I've ever spoken to has this experience, which I have. I'm at a standardized test. I read a sentence. I read it again. I read it a third time, and I say to myself, Jay, that isn't going into your brain. I don't know what that sentence says. And the reason for that most often is that you've lost focus, or it could be you've been distracted by something. You need a refocusing technique, and I'll share with you my favorite refocusing technique. You need to develop your own throughout your test prep. Here's mine. When that happens to me, I take a deep breath, close my eyes, like I want to just sort of emotionally get out of that, so get away from the test. Give my brain 5 or 6 seconds to just try to clear out, with the sense that when I open my eyes again, I'm going to be fully present, focused, and ready to go. And that works for me 95% of the time. Deep breath, close my eyes, clear my mind out. I open my eyes. I'm no longer distracted. I read that sentence, and 95% of the time it goes right in. So that's my primary method for refocusing. You need to develop something. I'm suggesting that you develop something through your test prep, and you work this out on your practice tests. You develop a method you have to be able to do it while you're seated, and it has to be quiet because you're at the official test. But you develop a method that allows you to sort of get away emotionally from the test for a few seconds, and then come back with the ability to refocus and really absorb what's in front of you. So what are the first steps in beginning to think about taking the MCAT? For those of you who have not taken the MCAT, for those of you who've taken the MCAT, it's a little bit different concept, although perhaps not, because if you took the prior version of the MCAT, you want to follow this instruction. And what I suggest to you is, if you're thinking about taking the MCAT, you're actually not serious until you take a practice test under test conditions. What that means is you go to any number of websites, just Google full MCAT practice test, and there'll be half a dozen websites at least that pop up. Go to one of those websites. Typically, they want you to sign in or whatever, and you take a full practice test under test conditions. What does test conditions mean? Test conditions are not at your kitchen table or at your desk. Test conditions involve you being someplace that you're not very familiar with and very comfortable in. I suggest a quiet corner of a library, because that's a place that's quiet but not silent, and there'll be people walking around in the background, because when you're taking the official MCAT, there's going to be you'll be in a testing center, and there'll be people coming in and out of the testing center. So you'll have earphones typically, and there won't be any noise, but there'll be a little movement in the background. So that's why a quiet corner in a library is probably the closest approximation you can get to actual test conditions. And obviously you want to time yourself very carefully. And then you want to score and analyze your practice test, and then you know your strengths and weaknesses. You use those results to inform your decisions, and you develop a test prep plan that fits your needs. I have GRE scores. I'm sorry, that should be MCAT scores are good for 5 years. So why wait? There's no good reason for you to say, well, I'll do it next year if you can do it this year. So I apologize for the GRE that popped up there, but it's the same for the MCAT. We can go to the next slide. So I like to use a lot of athletic and artistic metaphors and analogies, because folks understand those domains and they don't understand the testing domain. So if you had an important run coming up, you would do both long-term and short-term prep for that run. And so you would do long-term and short-term run for that test. Long-term and short-term prep for that for an important test in a similar way. You'd have a training program to build your strength and skills if you were running, and you would do the same thing. You'll do the same thing for the MCAT, and you need to build your stamina, because the test is a physical experience, particularly the MCAT, which is a very intense physical experience over many hours. Some folks say to do no short-term test prep. Very, very few folks say that in the MCAT prep domain. Pre-med students pretty much understand that everybody needs to do MCAT prep for months, which is what I'm suggesting. You want to peak performance without burning out. More is not always better. Work hard, but don't obsess. And there are different approaches to preparing for a test. I am a very relaxed, laid-back guy in my regular life. But when I get into a standardized test, I'm a test-taking machine. I suggest that, and being proactive in a tightly timed test where your objective is to get as many correct answers as you can in a short period of time, to the extent that you can be proactive, that you can go after it. You can even be, if you're aggressive. And you might say to yourself, well, I'm not an aggressive person. And I myself am not an aggressive person, but I tap into the proactivity that I do have, and I apply that when I'm at the test. And you can apply it in doing your test prep too, because test prep takes a lot of energy over time. And if you can apply that proactivity, to your test prep also. You're going to do better test prep, and the more proactive you are at the test, the better your score is going to be, and hopefully you'll get your best score. So there are a lot of things you can control and a few you can't. Here are all the things you can control. Okay, let's stop there. You can control, to a great extent, how much and how well you prep, when and where you take the test, the snacks you eat during the test, the breaks you take during the test, and what you do during the breaks, which is you always get up and walk around and hopefully get some fresh air. You can control a lot about your work. Maybe not a lot about your work, but whatever you can control about your work, control about your work. Whatever you can control about your family, control about your family. You can control a lot about your friends, even if it means saying to your best friends, look, I'm preparing for the MCAT. I don't have time to socialize until the MCAT's over. I'll see you in a couple months. I love you, but you must understand that I've got to apply my time to this task. Your good friends will be supportive, and they'll say, totally understood, great, go for it. We will celebrate after you take the official MCAT. That's how you manage your friends through the situation. So control what you can control, and you have a great deal of control over your physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual condition for the test. Now, in terms of what you can't control the exact questions that appear on the screen when you're taking the test. So the moral of the story is control as much as you can control. Take charge of this situation. Be the driver of this situation. Don't be driven by the situation. Be the driver of this situation. Control what you can control. Do intensive prep. Put your friends on hold. They'll understand if they're good friends. Do the things that I'm suggesting. Put yourself in this sweet spot to get your best score. So there's a few comments I want to make about cramming. Your MCAT prep, or if you take an MCAT prep course, and I encourage students to try as best you can to take a course. They're expensive. Try to find some funding on your undergraduate campus if you can. If you can't take an MCAT prep course, you need to self-prep, get some good materials. You have to get access to questions online, which you can do. You can pay for access to sets of questions online so that you can do them on computer. Try to take a course if you can. If you can't, get good materials and do the same intensive prep that someone taking a course would do. So your course or your self-prep is 14 to 16 weeks or more of cramming. And strive for some balance, as my friend Frank wanted me to emphasize, which I didn't emphasize when that medicine wheel screen was up, but I'll say it now. Frank emphasized that his tribe feels that the balance aspect of all those elements is what's ultimately important. So strive for some balance, but unlike some college courses, you must prep hard from day one. It's 14 to 16 weeks of full-out prep. It's not 7 or 8 weeks of coasting and then kicking it in for the last 5 or 6 or 7 weeks. That'll be insufficient prep. That's not the way to do this. This is a kind of a cram course situation, 14 to 16 weeks, and you can't cram a cram course. Also, this is very important. Your MCAT prep plan should make sense with good reasons for everything you do. If somebody says to you, be careful what people say. There's a lot of misinformation floating around about all these standardized tests and about the MCAT. For example, if somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I took the MCAT 5 years ago, and they start to tell you about their test, they didn't have that psych section. They took a different test. And it was different enough that they don't have a lot to tell you about the test that you're going to take. So There are even well-intentioned people who want to help you, but will convey incorrect information because they don't know. So be careful with even well-intentioned tips from anyone except an experienced test prep instructor. And if you hear something or someone tells you something about MCAT prep and you're not sure about it, email me. I get emails from students every day with all kinds of questions. And often I'm telling students, no, what that person told you is actually wrong. Here's the reason why it's wrong, and you shouldn't do that. There should be, I have good reasons for telling you everything I'm telling you in this webinar. And you should, if someone suggests something to you about the MCAT, the first question you should ask is why, and see if there's a good reason. If you hear, oh, well, I don't know, I just heard that, you might want to check with me as to whether I think there's a good reason for that particular comment or piece of advice. So, we could play a little game here, and I like to play this game. What have you heard about the MCAT that you're not sure about? It might sound a little weird. You're not sure if it's true. Feel free to type in either the chat or the question box your questions about anything, but particularly if you want to ask me something about what you might have heard, because I like to play that game because sometimes some crazy stuff comes out, and I can dispel some myths and correct some misperceptions which otherwise would be floating around out there if I didn't have a chance to comment on them. So I strongly encourage folks to type in if you have something for me to discuss. Next slide. I think this is my last slide, and that's good because we're leaving some time for questions. I love this slide. This is from a quote from John Wooden, who was the most successful college basketball coach in history, most successful men's college basketball coach, formerly coached at UCLA, won bunches of national titles. And so he talks about the 4 laws of learning, and I actually think training is a better word than learning. That fits in this quote. So I put training in parentheses. Are explanation, demonstration, imitation, and repetition. So the concept here is you explain something, and this applies for a test prep method or a basketball play. You explain it, you demonstrate it, again, a test prep method or a basketball play. The person, the basketball player or the test prep person, the person preparing for the MCAT, imitate the method, and then repetition. You repeat the method so that, and then the next sentence, the goal is to create a correct habit that can be produced instinctively under great pressure. So you're repeating the MCAT prep method for a particular question so that you can produce it instinctively in a tightly timed MCAT under some pressure, because the pressure is to get your best score. So to make sure this goal was achieved, he created 8 laws of learning. Again, I would say training. Namely, explanation, demonstration, imitation, and lots of repetition. So you can see, it's not merely looking at an MCAT test question technique, a method for answering a particular kind of bio question. It's not just saying about that method, oh, I see it, I understand it, here, I can do it. But it's practicing it so you develop a correct habit that becomes instinctive. And the only way that that happens is you do a whole bunch of bio questions like that until you get very comfortable with very quickly using the method and getting the correct answer and moving on. This was developed for basketball, but it really applies directly to test prep and to MCAT prep. So that is, I believe, my last slide, and let us strongly encourage questions, comments, and particularly if you want to ask about something you've heard or something that someone has told you about the MCAT, and you're wondering whether it's true, correct, accurate, etc. So do we have questions?
Thanks so much, Jay. Yeah, we do have one question from one of our viewers. She says, I'm 1 point from the minimum MCAT score for applying to a desired med school. Does that mean I missed only one question for that 1 point? Lastly, she intends to take this exam again in January to meet that score. Do you advise this? And because she does meet all other requirements to apply to that school.
No, it's not 1 point for one question. And I actually haven't looked at the scoring algorithms for this current MCAT to know how many questions equal how many points. But that's actually not what a student should be thinking about. A student shouldn't go into the MCAT saying to him or herself, I want to get one more point than I did last time. A student should go into the MCAT saying to him or herself, I really want to get my best score. That might be 2 points or 3 points above what the student got last time. Now, on the current MCAT score scale, there are only 14 points in any one section. So, a 14-point spread in any one section. So going up 1 point is a considerable improvement. It certainly can be done, but I would suggest the mindset of going in and getting my best score rather than going in to get one more point than I did last time. In terms of going in to take it again in January, since someone who has taken the MCAT before might not need a full 4 months to go in and take it again. It depends on how long ago this person did her MCAT preparation. But assuming that it was within the last year on this current version of the test, then going in to take an MCAT in January, I'd suggest a minimum of 2.5 to 3 months of preparation, just because it's likely that this student hasn't done MCAT preparation for the last 3 or 4 months. So on a subsequent MCAT, depending on the situation, a little bit less preparation time is warranted. But remember, the goal is to take the test. For those of you who haven't taken the MCAT yet, the goal is to take the test once, get your best score, and be done with it. No harm in taking it twice, just better to take it once if you can. So my strongest suggestion to this student is January sounds okay if you can get in like 2.5, 3 months of preparation before that. And we're just about 3 months from January, so that would mean that this person should be jumping on MCAT prep within the next couple of weeks. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, she did clarify and say that it was within the past year.
It was? Correct. Yeah. Well, I guessed that from the score scale. The 1 point increments is a newer is a current score scale. Other questions?
Don't be shy, everyone. Feel free to comment your questions, or if you've heard something about the MCAT that you'd like to get either confirmation or have Jay debunk that, for lack of a better term.
I've heard some crazy, stupid things about testing, which is why I encourage that people ask this stuff.
And like Jay said, if you do end up having questions later down the road, feel free to email him. His email is jayr@review.com. Or you can always send us an email to the Indigenous Education Inc. team at scholarships@cobellscholar.org. Jay, we do have another question. Is it normal to score less on your second try?
No, it's not normal to score less on your second try. Typically, and I'm hoping this is a person who has taken the test before, because if someone who has not taken the test before is thinking about taking it twice, as I've said before, that's not the best approach. What happens with standardized tests in general is that if you take the test the second time, how you do the second time depends on a couple of variables. And the key variables are, what was your prep like before the first time? And what was your prep like before the second time? And what was your experience at the test like the first time? And what was your experience at the test like the second time? Those are the variables. And I could give you all kinds of combinations of, someone who really preps well the first time and gets a pretty good score, and then kind of goes in with half-assed readiness the second time. They're not likely to equal their first score. And I can switch those all around. So the generic answer is most folks improve slightly with their second taking of any standardized test, MCAT included. Some folks drop, some folks score the same. But what happens usually depends on those variables that I described. And so if somebody described what those variables were, I could better predict whether they would do better, the same, or not quite as good as they did the first time.
All right, we're not getting any other questions, so I guess we'll give people a little bit more time to send in their questions.
Sure, we can take another minute, and then we're getting close to the hour, so I think we're able to share a lot of information with the folks who tuned in with us tonight, and I'm happy that you did.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for coming in, and thank you to Jay for taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk to us and our students about the MCAT. We're getting a lot of thank yous, but no questions. So I guess with that, we will kind of wrap up our MCAT webinar. If you are interested, stick around, or there'll be a new registration, a different link for our GMAT webinar, which will be following at 7:30 Mountain Standard Time. Like we said previously, if you have any questions, please email us at scholarships@cobellscholar.org, or feel free to email Jay at jayr@review.com with any questions or comments about the webinar or about the MCAT or any other post-secondary grad school kinds of tests. So with that, we'd like to thank you very much, Jay, for all of your time and everything that you've taught us and our students. And I guess with that, we can give you some closing remarks and then we'll sign off.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed the opportunity to do this. I'm hoping that we have more Native American students in medical school, and if this helps even one student gain admission and become a doc, that will be wonderful. But I hope it's actually many more students who gain admission to medical school. We need more Native folks in the medical community, and this is one way to go about it. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. I hope you got useful information. I hope you get your best MCAT score, and I hope you go to and are successful in medical school and help serve the health and medical needs of our communities. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll have a great night, and we will talk to you soon.